When it comes to developing highly advanced next-generation combat aircraft, there are a couple of different approaches to secrecy countries can take. You can deeply classify the project, hiding it from public view as long as possible, and then, as the Americans did with the B-21 Raider, eventually unveil it at an invitation-only event, with photograph and video only being taken from very specific angles. Or alternatively, you could just fly your new stuff in broad daylight over a densely populated area on Mao's birthday. And on the 26th of December 2024, the People's Republic of China appears to have gone with the latter option. And at a time where several US programs to field new manned and unmanned combat aircraft, including the NGAD 6th generation fighter, appear to be somewhat up in the air, or rather stuck on the ground in budget battles, Beijing appears to have decided to publicly show off 2 new airframes, including what appears to be a very large, fast, and stealthy platform that probably doesn't have an operational equivalent in any Western Air Force, which for the moment, analysts have tentatively designated the J-36. For an Air Force that not that long ago was limited to flying mostly derivatives of old Soviet and Russian designs, the stealthy 3-engine tailless aircraft gives a bit of a clue as to just how far China's aviation industry and its military ambitions have come since the dawn of the 21st century. And so today we're going to talk about those new aircraft that China showed off in December 2024, as well as more broadly the patterns of modernisation and development we've seen from the People's Liberation Army Air Force, what that might tell us about their goals, objectives, and what they see a future air war looking like, and what it might mean for the balance of power, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. To do that, we'll start by looking at the new Chinese designs themselves, and what we might be able to derive about their purpose and capabilities based on the physical features that we can see. Then we'll pivot to looking at the bigger picture of Chinese Air Force development, asking not just what these new designs might be able to do, but how they might fit together with all of the other designs that we've seen China develop and field. That'll branch into a discussion of air-to-air munitions and the potential challenges of future air combat, setting the stage for a future discussion of how these developments in China might shape the development and budget decisions being made by other air forces. To help cover some of the more technical aspects of this topic, I'm once again joined by Professor Justin Bronk. He's RUSI's Senior Research Fellow for Air Power and Technology, holds a professor position at the Royal Norwegian Air Force Academy, and I was very happy he was able to join me for a discussion on this topic today. As a disclaimer, obviously his expressed views are his own, as mine are mine, and he didn't exercise any editorial control over how this episode was edited and cut together. I'll also note the interview was long enough to merit being chopped into 2 parts, so what you'll be hearing today are most of the sections focused on China itself. Okay, so before we jump into specific Chinese designs, I wanted to give some broader context around China's efforts to modernise its air combat capabilities, and the way that might represent a massive shake-up of the post-1991 balance of air combat power. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the US Air Force and US Navy suddenly found their most credible opponent wasn't so credible anymore, and the old Soviet military development and production system basically ground to a halt. That left the United States Air Force more or less alone at the top of the podium, with a massive force structure and several development efforts conceived to fight an opponent that no longer existed. And so for years, many analysts began to take the technological superiority of the US in the air as basically a given. In the closing days of the 20th century, the US took the lead in stealth technology with the F-117 and the F-22 Raptor, and for a while, the gap only seemed to continue growing. For years, when no other country on the planet had successfully designed and fielded a 5th-generation fighter, America had designed and fielded 2. And the US is on the cusp of operationalising a next-generation stealth bomber, the B-21, before anyone else has fielded even an equivalent to its predecessor, the B-2 Spirit. Enabled by that enormous technological and quantitative advantage that we saw flaunted during conflicts like Desert Storm, the assumption has long been that the US in any conflict wouldn't be fighting for air superiority so much as air supremacy. And some competitors, like the Russian Federation, appear to have decided it was generally a better idea to focus on asymmetric responses, like ground-based air defense systems, rather than try to go nose-to-nose with the F-22s or F-35s in the air. Now, however, those decades of dominance might be facing a serious challenge. Because while many countries have flirted with 5th-generation concepts or stood up 6th-generation fighter design programs, none have moved with as much speed or production volume as the People's Republic of China. And that's included developing their own 5th-generation fighter designs and then moving to field them in quantity. While definitions of what exactly makes a 5th-generation fighter can be murky and contested, it's generally accepted that A, to be a 5th-generation fighter, you need to incorporate stealth features, and that B, there are at least 5 active or near-active designs globally that might meet that definition. The United States has 2, the F-22 Raptor and the F-35. The Russians have the Sukhoi 57, and the Chinese have both the large twin-engine J-20, which is believed to have first flown back in 2011 and finally entered service in 2017, and the much smaller, lighter, and more recent J-35. Actually, wait, sorry, that's not an image of a J-35, that's an F-35. That's a J-35. I have absolutely no idea how I could have got those two confused. As best as we can assess, the J-20 is likely intended to be a large, heavy, primarily air-to-air platform, capable of carrying a pretty serious payload of long-range air-to-air munitions in a more survivable platform compared to previous generation designs. The J-35, meanwhile, appears to be more of a multi-purpose stealth aircraft being built in multiple versions, including a Naval and Air Force one, designed to work both in the air superiority and strike roles. This obviously differentiates it greatly from the American F-35, which was intended to be a multi-purpose stealth aircraft built in multiple versions, including a Naval and Air Force one, designed to work both in the air superiority and strike role. J-35 does have 2 engines though, so there is that. In any case, with the introduction of the J-20 and the expected introduction of the J-35, we've slowly seen the PLAAF transition towards a force structure that you might recognise in the United States or with many Western air forces. A small but growing fleet of stealthy 5th-generation fighters, paired with a larger number of legacy 4th-generation systems, while development efforts raced forward for next-generation manned and unmanned platforms. And in December 2024, we got a pretty major indication of what some of those next-generation designs might look like, when the PRC very publicly flew 2 new designs with obvious stealthy features. A smaller Shenyang design we'll discuss a little later, tentatively designated the JXX, and this much larger design, which thanks to a couple of unique features, dominated a lot of the media attention. So far, the Chinese government hasn't publicly confirmed the official designation of this thing. But based on a couple of clues, including some markings on the aircraft, for now a lot of analysts are calling this thing the J-36. And the first response from many commentators, as this thing publicly came into view, and videos and photos subsequently found their way onto the internet, basically boiled down to, what on earth is that thing? Fortunately for us, when it comes to military equipment and especially aircraft design, while a lot of the details of particular systems tend to be very, very tightly classified, militaries can't really get around the fact that physics work the same way everywhere, and the horse is well and truly bolted if the plan was to classify all research that's ever been done into how aerodynamics work. So generally speaking, if you give different engineers the same rough technology base and the same rough requirement, there are decent odds they'll come up with solutions that look at least vaguely similar. And vice versa, you can often look at the physical characteristics of a thing and work backwards to figure out what it was designed to do. I made some jokes earlier about the Chinese J-35, for example, comparing it to the American F-35, but the reality is, if you want a medium-sized single-seat multi-purpose fighter with stealth characteristics, you're going to end up with a lot of aircraft using roughly the same shapes because that's what works from a combination stealth and aerodynamics perspective. If someone rolls up in something with tracks and 4 tons of armor plate, you can probably conclude it wasn't intended to win a Formula 1 race. So if we do look at what we're tentatively calling J-36 for the moment, what are some of the features that immediately stand out? Straight off the bat, the shape of the aircraft and the fact it's missing vertical control surfaces, i.e. a tail, suggests that stealth is probably very much front of mind, even if it means sacrificing manoeuvrability, which tends to happen when you remove control surfaces. It isn't, however, shaped like some other stealth, tailless aircraft we've seen in the past, like the American B-2 Spirit and B-21 Raider, which might suggest a willingness to sacrifice some of the all-aspect stealth performance that a flying wing can give you in exchange for getting more speed. That also ties into the fact that, strangely, this appears to be a 3-engine design, something which really hasn't been in vogue for frontline military aircraft since the Second World War. Finally, something that stands out by fighter standards is that this thing is bloody huge. Increasing the size of an aircraft is obviously a pretty simple way to increase its internal volume, which might give you more space for weapons or fuel, meaning more range. But even though it can solve performance problems, increasing the size of an aircraft absolutely isn't without trade-offs. In fact, all else being equal, it's often a pretty decent predictor of how much an aircraft is going to cost to fly per hour. And so, armed with a couple of initial observations like that of my own, I decided to put the question to Justin. What sort of clues do these visually apparent features actually give us? There are a few features about it that instantly stood out to me. It's very large, there's no traditional tail surfaces, it's got 3 engines, a very large weapon bay, and then there were those transparent side apertures. I just wanted to ask you what you think we can derive from its potential performance characteristics or its role based on just the visually apparent features.
Yeah, I mean, you've covered a fair few of the kind of obvious features already. The size and the configuration, aerodynamically speaking, are the 2 things that jump out immediately. The J-20 following it looked pretty small in comparison, and J-20S is not a small aeroplane. So, coupled with the sort of twin bogey type main landing gear, which would support this being a very comparatively heavy aircraft, because they felt the need to go with that twin bogey design. So clearly they're designing around a fairly significant takeoff weight. Little bit of side profile that we got from some of the angles would also support it being an airplane with a fair amount of internal volume, vertically speaking, at least in the center. That's slightly complicated by the third engine intake on the top, which of course brings in the requirement for another set of ducts, which will take up some of that internal volume, but by no means all of it. So yeah, the large size, certainly suggestive of a design spec that centers around quite a significant amount of range on internal fuel. And the unbroken chine line, if you like, the edge on the front of it, that it sort of stretches pretty unbrokenly from the nose right the way through to the trailing edge. And so, as Bill Sweetman pointed out in his analysis on this, that is one of the kind of hallmarks of a design that's going for all aspect stealth. So you see that kind of unbroken chine line on the B2 and also from what we've seen at the B21, but not traditionally on fighter designs that we're familiar with that go for stealth. So, F-22, F-35, J-20. Continuing in that vein, you've got a lack of vertical tail surfaces or vertical stabilizers. So the reason you would want vertical stabilizers is to impart stability in the yaw and to a degree the pitch axis during high alpha maneuvers. Essentially, in layman's terms, if you want your aircraft to be able to be pretty agile, particularly at higher angles of attack, which for traditional fighter type maneuvers, not just dogfighting, but also being able to maneuver aggressively to, for example, notch incoming missile attacks, and then quickly regain a hot nose-on position, fire, and then potentially notch or turn cold again rapidly. That kind of maneuverability pretty much requires vertical stabilizers and vertical tail surfaces. So you see that, for example, the F-22, has these huge canted vertical stabilizers, despite being an extremely stealthy design in the X and the K bands to a degree. But that's basically because they still prioritized really high levels of maneuverability and agility, both subsonic and supersonic, in that design, which hurts the stealth and also, of course, increases drag. The Chinese with the J-36, well, let's just use that designation, they're clearly not particularly concerned with high levels of maneuverability or agility, and nor with high angles of attack remaining controllable in various parts of the speed regime. Otherwise, you'd expect them to have included at least minimal vertical stabilizers. The J-20 itself has pretty small, all-moving canted vertical stabs, but they're still there, and of course also has forward canards to help with pitch. And so, yeah, it's broadband stealth and probably low drag supersonic performance at long range over maneuverability.
And that observation that we're probably looking at a design that favours stealth as well as speed and range over agility does, I think, lead into a quick observation about how different air fleets have approached the problem of survivability for current and next generation combat aircraft. Basically, how much agility are you willing or able, given your technology level, to give up in order to secure more stealth? If you imagine this being a spectrum, at one extreme you'd have the current French Air Force with the Rafale, which is going to rely on factors like performance, electronic warfare, agility, and its own sensor and offensive capabilities to avoid being shot down, because the aircraft itself isn't designed with any VLO features. Then you might have something like the Russian Sukhoi 57, which obviously incorporates some stealthy look and feel to it, but still looks like something that's really going to want to maneuver. It's worth noting that agility and performance absolutely can matter in terms of the defensive capabilities of an aircraft. Anecdotally, we have cases of Russian Sukhois in Ukraine evading Patriot interceptors. But then again, a stealth advocate might argue that maybe if they'd given up some of that agility in the design process for a lower signature, they might not have been shot at in the first place. Based on what we've heard about the US NGAD program and what we've now seen from China with J-36, suggests that both of those air force see a reason to go a bit more all-in on stealth for survivability in at least some of their next-generation combat aircraft. Because without those tail surfaces, you're absolutely not going to see those aircraft pulling off the kind of high-alpha bullshit that you might see from a clean F-16, a Hornet, or Russian flanker. And the reason I want to bring that up front is because occasionally you'll see articles and think pieces suggesting that the age of stealth is over, that next-generation Russian, Chinese, or American sensor systems and surface-to-air missiles, maybe operating using AI, will suddenly make stealth aircraft obsolete, just as vulnerable as their not-so-stealthy kin. If that were the likely case, though, it raises a question. If China, Russia, or the United States expected stealth to be countered, why invest so many resources and so much engineering effort building stealth features into just about every next-generation aircraft and UAV concept that we've seen? Basically, if we're trying to assess what a military actually thinks the future of warfare might look like, I think it's generally safer to follow the money, not the rhetoric. In any case, turning back to the J-36 itself, I then wanted to ask Justin where we thought the aircraft might be in its development journey.
One thing that does strike me as potentially plausible, although there's a disagreement, particularly in the sort of PLA Chinese language chatter watching community who have been tracking this for a while. I suspect, just from looking at the airframe configuration, that this may be, even if it is now an air-to-air focused development, which the J designation would suggest, as opposed to JH for attack strike. I suspect the roots of the airframe's development may have been in the long track JHXX, so the sort of regional strike bomber. Kind of think like a stealthy F-15E or Sukhoi 34 or F-111, because it's fairly fast to have gotten a fully developed airframe for the air-to-air role in what people are assuming, a lot of people are assuming this is a sort of NGAD style 6th generation fighter program at this stage, given that we're only 14 years from the J-20's first flight that we're aware of. And, just airframe and development, even prototype work, does take time. If it is, therefore, a kind of 6th generation fighter prototype that was developed from scratch as such, then it's probably at a pretty early stage of developmental work. So, of course, one of the big things we don't know is what stage this is. It's it hasn't been officially briefed or acknowledged by the Chinese government or the PLAAF or Chengdu, but it was clearly flown as a demonstration, flying it over a densely populated area in broad daylight.
Not exactly subtle as far as
not exactly
publicity
subtle,
goes.
right? Exactly. And so, clearly there was an intent to show this off. But the question there is this showing off, essentially a relatively early stage flying demonstrator for a longer term combat aircraft development program? For example, we know that some flight demonstrators have already flown for the NGAD program in the States, although of course we haven't seen them. And that, for example, the Tempest program, the Global Combat Aircraft program that the UK, Italy, and Japan are working on, that the plan is to have a flying demonstrator in the air around 2027, which will still be, even on the program's fairly ambitious timelines, around 8 years before they anticipate having an initial operational capability with the actual combat aircraft. So, there's a question of whether this is that kind of flying demonstrator on the Chinese part, or whether this is actually much further along in development and that they feel happy to acknowledge it now that it's, getting towards technical maturity and production. If it's the latter, I suspect it may have been the airframe that was being developed for some time for the JHXX, so sort of regional strike program, even if it has subsequently been actually tweaked and adapted towards a primarily air-to-air focus.
Okay, so that was an interesting thought, that despite having a fighter J designation, the aircraft we're calling J-36 may have actually come from a long-running Chinese regional attack bomber program, something more akin to a stealthy F-111 than a purpose-built competitor to America's NGAD. If you're used to a very mid-20th century definition of what makes a fighter and a bomber, then using a bomber as a fighter might sound like it makes about as much sense as delivering Uber Eats in a dump truck, because the kind of things a bomber might traditionally want, like a lot of internal volume for range and munitions, would be fairly antithetical to the kind of maneuverability that a fighter would want. But if you instead want a fighter that's going to mount a very large sensor system so it can yeet extreme range air-to-air missiles over the horizon, you might start to see a bit more crossover, and there are reasons people have generally assumed that the American NGAD concept would produce a very large, very expensive aircraft, much more likely to have a crew of 2 or even 3, as opposed to being a single-seater. The twin questions Justin and I turned to next then were, how might you be able to tell whether this thing was originally meant to be a bomber or a fighter? And secondly, in terms of effectiveness and impact, whether or not that even really matters.
In practical terms, it probably doesn't make a huge amount of difference either way. But the main distinction that I would expect to be looking for, if between those two kind of potential programmatic routes, would be the depth of the main weapons bay.
So I was going to say, so you have a very long mains weapons bay. My question is, do we have any indication as to whether this is going to be long but not particularly deep, in which case we're talking about next generation standoff air-to-air munitions, or is this thing going to have bomb truck potential?
Yeah, I mean, the depth of the weapons bay is a key question that, at least for me, is currently unanswered. As I said, from the not very high resolution but side-on views that we did get, there's clearly some significant depth to the aircraft itself. There's a sort of quite humped appearance on the top side, which is clearly a function of the primarily of the unusual split intake arrangement for the three engines. You've got two kind of quasi F-22 style intakes on the underside for the two outboard engines, and a sort of shrouded, potentially DSI type or divertless supersonic intake type inlet on the top for the third, presumably for the central engine. The question for the weapons bay then is essentially what shape and width is that ducting for the upper engine intake? Because if it's a very aggressive S-curve kind of going down into the body, then that might actually constrain significantly the space available to have a really deep weapons bay with the main bay that long. On the other hand, if it's a fairly shallow curve, which actually if you were assuming that this is going to be flying very high and the majority of radar threats would be kind of viewing the aircraft from roughly level or from below, then you might want a rather shallower curve to best obscure the fan blades from any radar observation, and therefore you might have quite a bit of space for a deep internal weapons bay. Clearly the reason why that matters is that if you have a shallow weapons bay, given the length, it's probably optimized around very long-range air-to-air missiles, particularly PL-17 or what people call PL-17, which is a sort of slightly over 6 meter long, very aerodynamically clean, very long-range beyond visual range air-to-air missile, so likely geared around particularly being an AWACS and tanker killer. In that context, that would really push interpretation of what the threat J-36 kind of represents for US forces in that air-to-air direction. On the other hand, if it's a reasonably deep weapons bay, and this is all relative, of course, because with such a large aircraft, even a kind of weapons bay that is relatively shallow compared to the overall mass of the aircraft could still be quite deep in absolute terms compared to the bays on something like an F-35 or an F-22 or a J-20 even. If it has the depth to incorporate sort of 2,000 to 3,000 pound class standoff munitions for air to surface, that could give it a really quite impressive regional striker role, both against land-based targets, so think particularly US air bases, and also potentially for anti-ship work, for which, of course, China has poured a lot of effort and money into developing a whole range of subsonic, supersonic, and even hypersonic ballistic anti-ship missiles. If you look, for example, at the weapons that are being currently looked at for integration into F-35's weapons bays, for the A and the C models at least, you have for example, the AARGM-ER, so the Advanced Anti-Radiation Guided Missile Extended Range, so AGM-88G, that's a pretty substantive missile, with very impressive standoff range and aerodynamic performance, designed specifically to strike high-end ground-based air defense radars and things. That's being worked on for internal carriage on an F-35 with the weapons bay size limitations that has. So I think it's probably a bit unsafe as a set of assumptions to look at the weapons bay on the J-36 and say, we don't think that's really deep enough to have serious air-to-surface munitions. Until kind of proven otherwise, my assumption would be that it certainly has that potential. The fact that there's no obvious kind of EOTS style, electro-optical targeting system style kind of undernose blister for something like a laser designator, I think reinforces what probably should be obvious from the design anyway, but that it's not intended to do kind of essentially laser designation laser designated bomb deliveries or kind of bombing in the traditional sense. But frankly, I think we're quite a ways beyond that in terms of the way that both China and the US and its allies would be anticipating some sort of clash going. Ground strike or air-to-surface strike, whether that be against ground targets or maritime targets, will be being done from pretty significant standoff ranges for the initial few weeks or even months of a high-end conflict in the Indo-Pacific. And so you'd be talking about serious missiles rather than kind of bombs, for want of a better term. So I think quite a bit of the discussion about whether this is a kind of next-gen fighter or next-gen regional bomber, quote unquote, probably suggests to people who are not specialists a rather misleading view of what a regional strike aircraft would actually be needing to carry. It's not lots of bombs. It would be some serious air-to-surface standoff missiles, of which you wouldn't need a hugely deep bay to have, relative to the overall size of the aircraft, to have a sizable capacity based on the layout that we've seen.
So again, there are a couple of interesting points there, including the fact we might be in an era where not all bombers carry bombs. But for me, one of the potentially most noteworthy points when it comes to assessing the impact this aircraft might have on the military balance between the People's Republic of China and some of its military competitors comes down to what kind of missiles you might be able to fit into the J-36 weapon bay. But before I honed in on that discussion about missiles, I first wanted to round things out when it came to Chinese aircraft development. Because as a general rule, whenever you're looking at the kind of systems and platforms that a country is choosing to develop and procure, it's important not to look at them in isolation. Because if you instead zoom out and look at the whole package, it might give you a clue about what kind of war they expect to fight and how they expect to fight it. In China's case, we haven't just seen the chonker of an aircraft that is J-36, but a number of other stealthy platforms as well, manned and unmanned, including a much smaller design that I'll show on screen now, which debuted at the same time as the J-36, but didn't get quite the same attention from the plane paparazzi.
And it stands to reason that if something does have to push closer towards the threat, it may not have to be this very large, presumably quite expensive, investment-intensive system when we've seen PLAAF begin to field so many other manned and unmanned platforms, which I think is a decent segue to move into viewing this, move you from the discomfort of speculation on one particular aircraft that we know relatively little about and the broader systems that the Chinese appear to be building towards. There's one other new system I'd ask for a brief comment on, which is the smaller, still stealthy design we saw demonstrated, which didn't get as much attention. And then perhaps a broader reflection on how all of these puzzle pieces fit together with J-20, J-35, the new enablers we've seen, et cetera, and the new Chinese concept of what an air war is likely to look like.
Yeah, so the kind of ugly stepchild in terms of not getting nearly as much attention from the fairly major PLAAF reveals in around Boxing Day is what appears to be Shenyang's sort of also next generation combat aircraft prototype that was flying around on the same day. It's much smaller. It's clearly a somewhat different stealth configuration, but still very much within the ballpark of the sort of, if you like, the stable that goes from blended wing, so flying wing body type aircraft, which in the Chinese stable, they already have at least one operational, which is the GJ-11, so Gongji 11, Gongji meaning attack, through kind of cranked kite style and then stretched cranked diamond style airframes, of which the Shenyang one sits at that kind of end of the spectrum. They're all different answers to a similar problem set, which is how do we get a given desired optimal cruise speed and aerodynamic performance while being as stealthy as possible within an unmanned or an uncrewed platform. The weapons bay, I think, capacity on the smaller Shenyang tech demonstrator that was flown, we've got less good resolution of it as well, but it would appear to be sufficient for at least a couple of air-to-air munitions. And again, depending on the depth, which we don't know, possibly even an air-to-surface standoff munition of some sort. Clearly, China, along with most leading aerospace nations, is looking at trying to field high-end penetrating uncrewed systems to act as the leading edge for its crewed penetrating systems and its massed traditional sort of, if you like, advanced fourth gen combat aircraft, whether that be sort of flanker or J-10 style or J-10 family fighters or H-6K bombers, whatever it happens to be. The threat that the US is particularly concerned about is not necessarily any one system. It's not, I've had discussions with people in the US who really do know quite a lot of the kind of highly classified picture on both sides. In big handfuls, the concern is less about Chinese airframe development individually kind of outstripping US capabilities in that region, in that sense. It's much more about the multiplying ways in which Chinese forces will be able to deliver, launch long-range missiles, both surface to surface, air to surface, surface to air, and also air-to-air munitions. And the growth in those missile types and capability and range, but then also their increasingly sophisticated and redundant, multiple redundant layered queuing options for how to actually complete those kill chains. So if you kind of zoom out from the individual platforms and look at Chinese force development as a whole, what they are clearly going for is having as many options as possible to have at least a sensor picture with contributions from orbital assets, airborne assets, maritime assets, surface assets, and being able to pass that data to whatever launch platform is best placed to fire at particularly key US assets like aircraft carriers, aerial refueling tankers, forward bases, those kind of things, and then have some redundant layers so that there is always something. Even if the US is able to disrupt some of it, the aim would be for them to always have something that can pass real-time target data updates to those very long-range missiles in flight. Because one of the issues with a very, very long-range missile system, particularly if it's anti-ship or anti-aircraft, in other words, what it's going after is moving, is that even if it's extremely fast, that missile will still take a long time to cover, hundreds of kilometers, or even more, up to even maybe 1,000 kilometers. And so if you're just relying on target data from the launch platform, or that's been passed to the launch platform at point of launch, there's plenty of opportunity for the target to potentially maneuver out of the basket, as it were, of that missile seeker when it comes into terminal. So things like the J-36, uncrewed systems forward, there's a lot of Chinese orbital development, both in terms of their own sensor capabilities, but also counter space capabilities to go after US ones and potentially protect their own, and cyber capabilities too. So looking for abilities to disrupt US answers to those kill webs.
Okay, so if you have a longer memory, a lot of the concepts being discussed there might seem very familiar from the episode we did on 6th generation fighters. You can imagine a future air combat battlefield that, like the ground battle in Ukraine, is increasingly transparent. You have increasingly powerful and increasingly numerous sensors, whether they be ground-based radars, space-based systems, drones forming sensor webs, and then all of those being networked together to support some incredibly dangerous weapon systems. What that probably lends itself to is a universe where you can't just send your non-stealthy 4th generation fighters straight into opposing airspace, or anywhere near opposing airspace. Because modern kill chains can be really bloody robust and dangerous, and you may just find yourself getting backhanded out of the sky. What we've seen forces, including the PLAAF, seem to gravitate towards then is a mixture of systems, each of which in very broad strokes makes a different set of trade-offs. You have unmanned systems that might be able to push further forward, both because they might be smaller and hard to detect, and if they do get shot down, it's probably less of a loss. Trade-off, you don't have the flexibility and jam resistance provided by having a human pilot in the cockpit. Then you might have very stealthy, very capable manned platforms that can survive by virtue of their stealth and other defensive capabilities, with the trade-off being that they might be horrendously expensive. Finally, you might still have your older, non-stealthy manned aircraft that can excel at things like carrying a large weapons load, for example, but which probably can't be used as that leading edge or to penetrate into enemy defences until those defences have been broken down by some of those more survivable assets. In China's case, unmanned combat aerial vehicles like Gongji 11 and manned platforms like J-20, J-35 and potentially J-36 all likely represent necessary components of that broader system of systems. The question though, whether you're talking about the US, the PRC or the Russian Federation, is whether the country has the capability yet to tie all of those components together.
The tactical details of how they actually then sequence the custody chains, the data link standards, the tactics that they're using between maritime, air, orbital, ground-based assets, I suspect not only are we still trying to work out how they exactly think they're going to do that, I suspect the PLA is also still trying to work out how best to accomplish that. We know from US efforts on what they would term now CJAD C2, so Combined Joint All-Domain Command and Control. They need to add a few more C's in there, I think, to make the acronym nicer. But apparently it's CJAD C2 because combined is with allies and joint is between domains, which fair enough, I suppose. But those efforts are aiming at very, very similar capabilities, albeit for slightly different operational output requirements. But to synchronize sensor and shooter, essentially data exchange between airborne, maritime, orbital, and potentially land-based assets across US forces and allies. And we know from the US side that is really difficult to do. It's very easy to conceptually articulate, it's very easy to put on a PowerPoint slide, but actually getting it to work reliably is unbelievably complicated and difficult.
Just for that, I'm going to overlay a PowerPoint slide at that particular moment.
And as promised, there are some cracking slides out there that describe the CJAD C2 concept, all of which are obviously very easy to read and interpret. I'm a big fan of this placemat, for example, which cleanly describes the concept, albeit without the combined element at the start. But I'd suggest focusing on those elements of the decision cycle in the centre, the ability to sense, make sense, and then effectively act. In your ideal future scenario, you might have a battle space that's being utterly big brothered by just about every friendly sensor platform imaginable. All of that sensor information is then being securely networked together, fused and analysed, probably with the assistance of some pretty impressive automated tools, given the sheer volume of data that we're talking about here. And then when the information has been processed and a decision has been taken to act, the system is then capable of ordering the effect or collection of effects that it wants, whether that be a cyber attack, electronic warfare, or a missile to the face, from whatever asset or collection of assets is best placed to deliver it. And ideally, this networking capability would be sufficiently robust that even if you start blasting some pretty significant holes in it, whether that be by shooting down satellites, aircraft, sinking submarines, destroying drones, or destroying headquarters and command nodes, the system is capable of reconfiguring and redelegating on the fly. So you get a kind of a Borg cube effect, where in order to put the whole thing out of action, you need to destroy a lot of those underlying components. My next question then focused on one of the tools at the sharp end of that process. Your sensors and network might enable you to find targets, but it's munitions that destroy them. And so I thought it was important to ask about the potential implications of J-36 in the context of a race towards longer and longer-ranged air-to-air missiles.
We've come a long way from the days of Phoenix, let's put it that way. There's longer and longer range options, it seems, entering arsenals or plan to enter arsenals. So the Americans with AIM 260 and 174B, which was a surprise, at least to me, when it was unveiled, but interesting concepts. PL-15, PL-17 from China, Meteor in Europe, 77M and 37M in Russia. What should we read into that focus on extending range? And how do you assess, I think, the balance in terms of that long-range capability over the next 10 to 15 years?
Yeah, so as you say, that there's a very, very discernible trend towards really significantly extending the range of particularly air-to-air munitions, but also air-to-surface munitions and surface-to-air munitions, basically as a fairly logical answer to just ever-increasing lethality as sensor and missile seeker integration gets better and better across pretty much all the leading military nations, and indeed most of the sort of second tier of military nations as well. As it gets harder and harder to break your opponent's immediate kill chain from, if you just keep it simple, from a let's say like a fire control radar or something like an S-400 Russian air defense system getting more and more resistant to jamming, more and more, faster and faster adaptation in terms of frequency and pulse repetition patterns and its ability to rapidly adapt to jamming and reject sideload jamming and that kind of stuff. So it's getting harder and harder to kind of directly break the lock in simplistic terms if you're engaged by, let's say, an S-400 system. And the missiles themselves are getting more and more capable at different rates depending on the country and the systems you look at. One of the obvious answers is to be able to engage them from further away so that you have more time to respond to those shots, or even just can defeat them by the simple expedient of turning cold and going in the opposite direction for a while to run the missile out of energy. But that, of course, means that, if you were looking at that S-400 example, there's a strong evolutionary pressure, if you like, towards SEAD and DEAD munitions that are and air-to-air munitions that are ever longer ranged. And you see the same in the air-to-air domain, of course, as well, across the board. There's a few trade-offs to that. First and foremost, cost and size. So the further you want your air-to-air missile to go, the more fuel it's got to carry, or the more complex your propulsion arrangement has to be, or both. So one approach would be the AIM-174 Bravo approach. So this is the new very long-range air-to-air missile in the US Navy's arsenal, which is essentially a standard missile 6, an SM-6, without the normal vertical launch booster, which is compensated for by coming off a Super Hornet at presumably about as high and fast as the Super Hornet can haul something so big and with so much drag, especially given that their pylons are canted outwards slightly. So maybe not terribly high and fast, but enough.
It'll do its best.
Exactly. The Super Hornet will do its best. What you've got there is just essentially a bigger rocket. So, by dint of carrying far more rocket propellant than something like an AMRAAM, that will go massively further with a given amount of intercept energy remaining from a given launch altitude and speed compared to an AMRAAM. The Meteor approach is a bit different, which is where you essentially you have a much more complex propulsion system with ramjets, but a small rocket motor. So you still need enough rocket boost to get it up to the speeds that the ramjets require to work. And but then you have essentially ramjet power, which is much more fuel efficient for a given amount of propellant stored in a given size missile to take you further. And you also see ramjet power in, for example, the Russian KH-31 series. And a few other Chinese missiles, for example, as well, use ramjets. Extending those out, though, either with a much bigger missile or with a more complex propulsion system, you're getting increasing cost. The other thing is, for a lot of platforms, they actually are starting to run up against the limits of what their own radar and data link capacity can support in terms of really long-range engagements. And so, for example, if you were to put, hypothetically, a Meteor missile on a much older platform, the integration hasn't been done, so I'm just spitballing here, and it's just a hypothetical example. But if you were to, say, take Meteor and try and integrate it onto an early pattern F-16, even though
I wonder why you picked that example.
No idea. But even though the fighter could absolutely carry it, and Meteor would be designed around an AMRAAM launch rail and weights and sizes, so you could, I'm sure, get the integration through in that sense. The radar on that F-16 and the data link to pass information to the missile back and forth in flight just isn't set up for anything like the ranges that you would be using that Meteor efficiently at, and because that platform was never designed around it. So equally, if you're looking at something like PL-15 or PL-17, for PL-15 to employ at the kind of ranges sort of a little bit beyond AMRAAM D3 probably that missile should give you kinematically, you're relying on a system that would need to have a very, very powerful, probably pretty large aperture AESA radar, say like J-20, and a very good data link in order to give you the sensor picture at those max ranges to essentially supply targeting data and then course corrections to the missile in flight. If you're going into PL-17 or SM-6, so AM-120, or AIM-174 Bravo, or any of these really long-range air-to-air missiles, you're almost by definition into third-party targeting. In other words, you're probably going to have to rely, in most situations at least, on an off-board source of real-time target information to complete that engagement at those maximum ranges that the missiles are theoretically capable of, partly due to the curvature of the Earth, but also as people are also pursuing more and more stealthy platforms, effective radar detection and weapons-grade track ranges will decrease for a given radar against a given target. So yeah, you almost certainly will continue to want a mix of really long range and medium range and short range air-to-air missiles, because firstly, as I said, there's also this kind of interesting trade-off between ranges at which you will detect stealth aircraft. So if you have stealth versus stealth in kind of very oversimplified terms, those two aircraft, let's say like an F-22 or a J-20, might well detect each other significantly closer to each other than that F-22 certainly would detect something like a flanker, or the J-20 would detect something like an F-15. And so having a really long-range air-to-air missile will still give you a better probability of kill and a longer no-escape zone, or a larger no-escape zone for your missile at a given altitude and speed. But if you're trading off missile volume, which you would be either in terms of cost or internal space, you may actually, at practical combat ranges for some scenarios, prefer having a larger number of still at those ranges very lethal AIM-120s, for example, or AIM-260s when they come in. You see, for example, RAF practice with Typhoon, you often see mixed loads. So, say 2 Meteor, 2 AMRAAM, 4 ASRAAM. That is not just a function of stockpiles. That is partly because you don't necessarily, it's not necessarily optimal to have a Meteor within certain ranges. You might actually prefer to have an AMRAAM. Even though the kinematic performance of the Meteor for long-range shots is better, there are various characteristics of AMRAAM in this case that would actually make it optimal within certain distances, which of course are classified.
Okay, so let's zoom out for a moment and have a look at the long-range air-to-air missile race and how an aircraft like J-36 might impact it. As Justin said, when countries are trying to build a longer-ranged air-to-air missile, there are two main approaches you can take. You can increase sophistication to try and pack more range into the same broad form factor, the way the Europeans have managed with Meteor and the Americans are planning to do with AIM-260. If you want a quick refresh on any of these missiles, by the way, I will link the episode I did on air-to-air missiles. But for now, the Spark Notes version would be that most of the major military powers appear to have gone with both. For long-range shots, Russia has the R-77M, sometimes referred to as the AMRAAMsky when it was first introduced as the R-77, and then for very long-range shots, they have this absolute chonker of missile, the R-37M. The Americans currently have the AMRAAM for long-range shots and are working on the AIM-260, which seeks to deliver even more range in an AMRAAM-sized package. And then towards the tail end of last year, we saw this thing, the AIM-174B, which is basically the SM-6 surface-to-air missile strapped to an FA-18 Hornet. The result is likely one of the longest-ranged air-to-air missiles in service anywhere on the planet, with an officially confirmed range of 150 miles, 240 kilometres, but with some sources estimating much longer ranges out to the roughly 400-kilometre mark, which, to give you a sense of scale, would mean an aircraft flying over Helsinki in Finland would be able to hit a target over St. Petersburg, Russia, or if the 100 Years' War ever comes off hiatus, being able to sling a missile from London to Paris or vice versa. As a side note, the US Navy's also unveiled a new designation for Hornets when they're carrying a heavy air-to-air loadout of 9 air-to-air missiles, so welcome to the subtly named FA-18 Murder Hornet. So far, the Europeans appear to have been mostly satisfied with the range offered by Meteor, but the PRC has both long and very long-ranged options. PL-15, which is already about 35 centimetres longer and significantly heavier than AMRAAM, but which the PLAA still managed to fit into a fighter weapons bay through the simple expedient of building a bigger fighter in the form of the J-20, and then the PL-17, which is a massive 6 metres long, 2 metres longer than PL-15 or AIM-120, and which RUSI assesses to be in the 400-kilometre range category. So clearly Russia, China and the United States all have at least one design of relatively long-range, medium-sized air-to-air missile, and then a much larger, heavier, very long-range option. A key point I'd suggest, however, is that the range of a missile might be relative to what kind of platforms you might be able to fit it on and how close you might be able to get it to the target, because adding 100 kilometres of range to a missile might not help you much if you have to fire it from 100 kilometres further away. The reason that might be the case is because there are basic physical limits on what you can fit into the internal weapons bay on various stealth fighter designs. The AMRAAM fits into the internal weapons bay of the F-35 and F-22. PL-15 fits into the bay on the J-20, and you can fit R-77M into the weapons bay on the Sukhoi 57. The bigger missiles, however, are a bit more of a challenge, and as such, so far, we've seen them mostly being trucked around by non-stealthy, fourth-generation fighters that presumably would have to stay further away from the threat in the first place. The Russians have been launching R-37M from MiG-31 and Sukhoi 35. The Americans have shown off AIM-174B on an FA-18 Super Hornet, although there's no reason to suggest it couldn't fit on something like the F-15EX as well, and the sightings of what we're calling PL-17 have generally been on Chinese flanker derivatives. And so if you're an Air Force trying to protect, for example, your tankers, your AWACS, or your very valuable enablers from these very long-range, very dangerous air-to-air munitions, one option you still might have is to try and push back and zone out these non-stealthy platforms that are carrying them. The challenge an aircraft like J-36 might pose, however, is that it might look at this rule, which says you can't carry very long-ranged air-to-air missiles internally, and basically ask, why not? Through the simple expedient of building a much larger stealth aircraft, the Chinese might be able to get the sort of weapon bay length you need to fit these very dangerous long-range munitions. And then suddenly, you're potentially combining hundreds of kilometres of missile range with an aircraft that might have the kind of stealth and speed necessary to get much further forward. And that potentially might create scenarios where those tankers, AWACS and other enablers are being pushed even further back, something which might be very impactful if you're talking about fighter fleets based around aircraft like the F-35 that don't have that same internal volume, don't have the same range on internal fuel, and really do rely on tanker support to get the kind of combat radius you might want in the Indo-Pacific. The argument doesn't even really specifically have to be about PL-17, but rather the options that having a very stealthy next-generation aircraft with a very long weapons bay might give you. For any given level of technological sophistication, you're going to be able to make a bigger missile go further. And so if an aircraft like J-36 is deployed in that kind of enabler assassin role, it might help give the PLAAF the air combat equivalent of the longer stick. Similarly, if the aircraft is being used more in an attack bomber capacity, firing long-range standoff air-to-ground munitions, then being able to safely launch them from closer to your target might give you comparatively more reach than if you had to launch those same munitions from a non-stealthy platform further back. And then if you build on that concept a little, there's another approach we've seen some countries experiment with when it comes to trying to pursue longer and longer reach. Instead of building a bigger airplane to accommodate a larger, more expensive, longer-ranged air-to-air missile, what if instead you built a smaller, cheaper, shorter-ranged air-to-air missile, put that on a small drone intended to be stealthy, attritable, or both, and achieve reach by pushing your shooter as close as possible to the opposing shootee? Even compared to many of their potential competitors, the PRC appears to have invested very heavily in stealthy, unmanned air combat systems. What you're seeing here, for example, is the GJ-11 Sharp Sword, which is believed to be a large, single-engined, relatively stealthy UCAV, which, according to US estimates, might be able to carry a weapons payload of up to 2 tons, more than 4,000 pounds. And so my next question to Justin was basically, which of these air-to-air concepts might the PLAAF be favouring? Longer-range missiles to give larger aircraft more standoff range, or smaller missiles that you might be able to fit onto drones to push closer to the target?
2 quick follow-ups I wanted to throw in here. The first is conceptual and the second is observational. On the concept side, it seems like we've seen developments that go in 2 directions. One is to increase the range of the air-to-air munition from the primary platform, and the second is to put a shorter-range air-to-air munition on a small unmanned platform, then you're going to push the launch platform closer to whatever you're engaging and use a cheaper missile. We've seen Western forces appear to hedge their bets and go for both at the same time. Is that track with what we're seeing from the PLAAF as well?
Yeah, I think it does track. Clearly, the PLAAF is actually ahead in many ways of a lot of almost every Western Air Force. You could argue the toss on the US, but still in some areas ahead in terms of actually fielding really long-range air-to-air missiles. So PL-15 has been in production for quite a while now. It has probably a longer effective range than at least the majority of AMRAAM models. And PL-17 also clearly significantly longer range than that, and has been, again, in test and production for quite a while. Whereas the US is only now really kind of, at least publicly, pushing ahead with AIM-260, which has had some issues in development. Of course, it's challenging to get significantly greater range out of a relatively similar form factor to AMRAAM, but also for AIM-174B breaking cover quite recently. So, in some ways, China's ahead. But of course, they're also ahead in terms of their, at least publicly acknowledged, unmanned combat aerial vehicles, so UCAVs, so survivable uncrewed systems, because Gongji-11 has been declared as combat capable and in service for a couple of years now, whereas the US has still yet to at least publicly acknowledge fielding any lethal uncrewed system designed for kind of stealthy penetrating work. They've acknowledged the RQ-170 and all but acknowledged what we call the RQ-180, which is a larger penetrating I-STAR aircraft, but not UCAVs, despite lots and lots of testing, some of which is in the public domain. It's fascinating if you go and read the War Zone with Tyler Rogoway did a fantastic piece, which I'd highly recommend people go and look up if they're interested. Years ago now, called something like the worrying case of the missing of the US Air Force's missing UCAVs, or the US's missing UCAVs. Basically, looking at some of the work that was done with programs like X-45 and X-47, Bravo, and then and UCLASS and other programs, to then say, well, either these things were developed to a point and are still being pursued, but without acknowledgement, which is problematic from a force planning and public budget scrutiny set of reasons, or they were developed to this point, showed loads of promise, and then killed by the fighter mafia, essentially. One of the two, both of which are problematic in terms of interpretations. So the US has been looking at these technologies for a very long time and has had the technology to build them and test them successfully for a very long time, since at least the mid-2000s. China's a little bit ahead in terms of what it's publicly declared, and is now clearly pushing ahead, as we saw from Shenyang recently, with additional public not quite acknowledged, but publicly revealed flight test articles, at least, if not frontline capabilities.
After that segment, most of the rest of the interview pivoted away from developments in China itself towards next-generation fighter programs in some other countries, how they appear to be tracking compared to the progress we've seen out of China, and how China making the decision to show off some of these new platforms and capabilities might impact those programs. But given we're already nearly at the hour mark, I might save that for a future episode, and instead close out with a broader observation around the PRC's military modernisation efforts. In the past, often when I've talked about next-generation Russian weapon development programs like the T-14 Armada or the Sukhoi 75 Checkmate, I've often been quite pessimistic and sometimes outright dismissive of the prospect they might meaningfully adjust the overall military balance. Sometimes I've seen comments suggesting that that represents an anti-Russian or a pro-Western bias, but I'd argue those assessments are more just a reflection of acknowledging the limitations of Russia's defence industry and available resources. Even after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia has never been without talented military designers that are capable of coming up with very interesting concepts and developing interesting designs. Where they've often struggled is then having the resources necessary to refine those designs and produce them in militarily useful quantities on reasonable timelines. Russia might be able to design a stealth bomber or next-generation tank, but unless an export customer is willing to fund it, getting it built in quantity might be a challenge. When you're talking about military modernisation in China, however, it's a completely different setting. Even if the country is far from universally catching up with the United States and allies in terms of the technology level and capabilities of a lot of its military products, once China successfully designs something that they want and solves the engineering challenges involved, they're far more likely to have the manufacturing base and the funding to turn concepts into forces. In 2019, the Russian Defense Ministry signed a contract for 76 Sukhoi 57s to be produced by the end of 2027. By contrast, the PRC can likely consistently produce more than that many J-20s every year, and the 1,000th F-35 was reportedly delivered to the US 185th Fighter Group in mid-2024. As we saw today, the ongoing modernisation of the Chinese Air Force is not just about cloning a Western Air Force with Chinese characteristics. Instead, it involves framing up their own doctrine, their own concept of operations, which leans on platforms and system types that don't always have direct equivalents in Western forces, with J-36, at least for the moment, representing perhaps the most recent example. Obviously, the sheer amount of opacity in China around things like the defence budget and new military developments can make any degree of certainty very hard to achieve. There's always the danger involved in looking at the limited amount that we see, making a couple of assumptions, and then extrapolating out to infinity. Quite famously during the Cold War, when NATO first discovered the existence of the very large Soviet interceptor, the MiG-25 Foxbat, there was a lot of apprehension about how dangerous it might be, because if you took an airframe that size and engines that size, and then built the whole thing out of advanced materials, it would likely have some pretty insane performance. Those fears helped shape the US requirements that would ultimately give us the F-15 Eagle, only for the US to later discover that the MiG-25 wasn't the super fighter they feared it might be, because the Soviets hadn't built it out of expensive advanced materials, they just used steel. While that kind of misevaluation is always possible, however, I'd be cautious about assuming it when it comes to the PLAAF, with one of the biggest arguments always coming back to the pace of change that we've seen so far. In the early 1990s, a lot of the PLAAF's frontline fighter strength was made up of a MiG-21 derivative, the Chengdu J-7, and they would potentially have been facing off against the likes of F-16 and F-15. By the early 2000s, the leading edge were now mostly fourth-generation designs, aircraft like the J-10 and derivatives of the Russian flanker, and they would have been matched up against, once again, F-16s, F-15s, and the first F-22s. By 2017, China had introduced a fifth-generation fighter, the J-20, and in the years since has showed off a variety of other new systems, including stealthy UCAVs, new missiles, new combat aircraft designs, new enablers, all while pushing forward with other developments like a new generation stealth bomber and what today we call the J-36. The point is that while the broader capabilities of the PLAAF today, or those of the J-36 more specifically, are very much up for debate, I'd argue the broader trend isn't. And as Beijing continues to compete with other nations that have interests in the Indo-Pacific, I expect it's a pretty safe bet that in the coming years, we'll see more where J-36 came from. And because of the inevitable tendency of competition to drive technical developments forward, it seems very likely that these Chinese efforts will push other countries to respond, and vice versa. But ultimately, that broader aerial arms race, and what we might be seeing other countries field in the coming years, is a question for another time. And okay, channel update to close out. I'll keep it brief because, well, hopefully it doesn't sound like it. I am feeling a bit under the weather at the moment, so at least for this week, I'll stick to the basics. Firstly, thank you very much to Justin for being so generous with his time. As noted, this interview ended up being more than an hour long, hence why I ultimately decided to cut it into 2 episodes rather than try to squish it all into one. It's not finalised yet when the second half, focusing on international developments, is likely to release, but as soon as I have news on that, I'll be sure to let you all know. I'm also aware that on this channel, for what I hope are quite understandable reasons, we put a lot of focus on the fighting in Ukraine. But I do think that, especially from a defence economics point of view, there's a lot of value in keeping a close eye on developments in the Asia-Pacific, and specifically out of China. It very much is the case of a rising military power whose scientific, engineering and defence industrial potential very much needs to be respected and taken seriously. And so you should probably expect a few more videos on the PLA and militaries across the broader region as we move through 2025. Beyond that, thank you very much to all of you for your ongoing engagement, support and always, and I do hope to see you all again next week.